Dr. Les Hardin. He is a professor at Kentucky Christian University in New Testament theology. And he's been with us the last couple of weeks. You maybe have seen him around. He's been teaching during our life group hour in between services. He'll be wrapping that up this week. So right after this service in the Stage 2 room, he'll do that final session there. But this morning we have the privilege of having him come to preach as well. So won't you welcome Dr. Les Hardin to the platform.
All right, cool it. You might not like what I have to say by the time I get done here. In April of this year, a longtime friend asked me to evaluate the website of a men's movement that was making some inroads into his church. It was called Wake Up Warrior, and it promised men all the things they ever wanted in the American version of the Christian life. A better marriage, a better relationship with your kids, kids who behave properly, and material success in the business and in the home. He sent it to me on April 1st. So I thought this is some kind of April Fool's joke. Even though it had these quasi-Christian backgrounds, the focus of the website was so absolutely pagan. I thought, there's no way this is real. The homepage is littered with testimonies of men who turned their modest businesses into multi-million-dollar ventures, of men who saved their broken marriages through this movement's philosophy, and testimonies of unbridled happiness in the material life that their philosophy promises. And all this can all be yours for a small fee of $2,000. What absolutely shocked me, though, was the excessive and repetitive use on the website, on the homepage, of the word power. 19 times the word power or powerful appears on the homepage of that movement's website. Unlimited power. 4 times your power. Unlock your power. Stop leaking power are the catchphrases and buzzwords that form the DNA of this movement. And because this was taking inroads into this friend's church, he wanted me to evaluate. And here was my evaluation. I said the philosophy here is rooted in the worship of triumph and dominance. It has very little to do with the kingdom ethics of Jesus. It does not worship the Lamb who willingly gave up his power and success to die for the sins of the world. It worships Ares, Mars, Thor, and Baal, the gods of power and thunder. In the words of the Apostle John, the Revelator, it looks like the Lamb, but it speaks like the dragon. It begs the question for us, what place does power have in the kingdom of God? What does true power look like? What is the relationship of power to godliness, to mercy, to kindness, and to the character of God? That's the question on the table today as we continue our study of the life and the reign of King David. Now let's recap where we've been. I've been listening to all the sermons. I just didn't come in here and what have you been doing, Seth? I listened. I didn't critique. I just listened. Let's recap where we've been. After God led the Hebrews out of Egypt and gave them a place to settle down, they began to ask God for a king. Their request is incredibly offensive. The job of an ancient king is to lead, feed, and protect. Yahweh had been leading them in smoke and fire for 40 years. Yahweh had been feeding them quail fillet sandwiches 6 days a week for 40 years. Yahweh had been protecting them from the marauding bandits that wanted to eradicate them for 40 years. So Yahweh's been leading, feeding, and protecting. So their request for a king was in essence a way of saying, Yahweh's not our king. Their request is eerily reminiscent of the residents of Jerusalem in Jesus' trial who told Pilate, we have no king but Caesar. So Yahweh gave them what they asked for. A brutish, selfish thug named Saul. Saul was all about power, and particularly his own power. It took all of about, 15 minutes for the people to realize they'd made a mistake. So in a gracious display of his character, Yahweh met that power with mercy and began working out a way to give the people the human king who was committed to Yahweh that they deserved. Samuel anointed David to be that king, and David is noted as someone who was loyal to Yahweh, who sought God's will, who never relied on his own name, reputation, and power, but who trusted in the power of Yahweh to see him through. And when David became king, he defeated Yahweh's enemies. He restored peace to Jerusalem. Yahweh was so impressed with David that he made a covenant with David, that one of his heirs would sit on the throne of Israel forever. That's where we've come to. We pick up the story today in 2 Samuel chapter 8. If you got your Holly Bibles, you might want to turn there. It's on page 2 Samuel chapter 8. I don't know what, in my Bible, it's like page 560. If you're scrolling on your iPhones or your J-phones, it's in 2 Samuel 8. That's all I got for you. In this section of 2 Samuel, the writer puts us in a very difficult position to think through what actually constitutes power, what makes a true king, and how will the nations respond when Yahweh becomes Israel's true and rightful king. In 2 Samuel 8, the nations meet the power of God. 2 Samuel 8 opens with all kinds of power language. Here are the highlights. I'm not going to read the whole thing for you, but here are the highlights. David defeated the Philistines and subdued them. David defeated the Moabites. The Moabites became subject to David. David defeated Hadad-Ezer, subduing 1,000 of his chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 foot soldiers. David struck down 22,000 Arameans. David took the gold shields, and in the next verse says, and a large quantity of bronze from Hadad-Ezer. David became famous for striking down 18,000 Edomites. All the Edomites became subject to David. See all the power language, all the subjugation language. David's legacy as a giant-killing warrior is cemented very early in his reign as he becomes known as a king who wields great power. But this power was not David's. It was Yahweh's. And the author is careful to note for us that twice, in this text, Samuel notes for us, and here's a quote, Yahweh gave David victory everywhere he went. The battle was David's, but the victory was Yahweh's. As it had been with the lion and the bear, as it had been with Goliath, David was loyal to Yahweh, and Yahweh secured David his victory. Not just for David, but for his people. In 2 Samuel 9, we see that David's power is met with mercy. In the next chapter, Samuel puts forward a major question. It's a question that was put to Jesus in subtle ways during his temptation, and the question put to every one of David's descendants who assumed the throne. What is the relationship of power to kindness? Is being king solely a matter of power, of military might, of terrifying your enemies, of subjugating your people? Lots of folks in world history, including our own history, have thought that way. Or does being king mean using such power to help those in need? The writer puts us in the middle of that question as he opens chapter 9. After all of these descriptions of David as conqueror, as a man of power and subjugation, we see David having not lost his ability to show kindness and mercy. David inquires in chapter 9 whether there's anyone in the house of Saul that he can be kind to. Now, if you think back through the story, David and Saul, they didn't get along that well. Saul was jealous that David, not one of his own sons, was going to be the next king. But no matter how tense their relationship got, no matter how many times Saul tried to kill David, David would not do harm to Saul. He recognized that Saul was still the one that God had decreed to be king, and he would not dishonor Yahweh by doing harm to the king of his people. So as we near the end of Saul's family line, David asks one more time, is there anyone whose kindness I can show to the house of Saul? David had a lifelong friendship with Saul's son, Jonathan. So intense was their friendship that during Saul's murderous phase, Jonathan and David entered into a covenant to look out for one another's descendants. Now, that's the second or third time we've come upon that word covenant. And to understand it properly, we have to understand what's next in the story. We have to understand what covenant means. A covenant is typically described as an agreement between two parties. That's true, but it's deeper than that. You and I tend to think of a covenant in terms of a contract. We don't have covenants in our cultures. We have contracts, and so that's how we tend to think of it. I have a contract with AT&T. They provide me with less than reliable cell service. I give them $8,000 a month. That's how it works. Yes, it is an agreement between two parties, but it's one that can be nullified at any time. If I don't like my service plan, if I don't like my fees, if I find a better deal, or if I just want out, I can arrange all that and nullify the contract, no harm, no foul. That's not what a covenant is. A covenant, in ancient Near Eastern context, is a lifelong agreement, sealed in blood, escapable only by death. God's covenant with Abraham was an eternal covenant, an agreement to look out for Abraham's best interests and for Abraham to look out for God's forever. God's covenant with David, for David to look out for Yahweh's best interests and for Yahweh to be bound by the covenant to always look out for David's best interests, is an eternal covenant. This is precisely why the Bathsheba incident is such a problem for Yahweh. David has made Yahweh look bad, but Yahweh is bound by the terms of the covenant to continue to look out for David's best interests. And so it is between David and Jonathan. David and Jonathan are in covenant. And David is obligated to look out for Jonathan's family as long as David is living. Jonathan had one son remaining, a young man whose name is so easy to pronounce, Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth had an accident when he was just a baby that left both of his feet permanently damaged. He couldn't walk without assistance, and he was reliant upon the servants of his grandfather, King Saul, to look out for him and take care of him. He couldn't walk without assistance, and he relied on Saul's former servants to provide for him. David took the opportunity in the midst of all of these displays of military power, right on the heels of chapter 8, where David has subdued everyone around, to show kindness to Jonathan's son. Here's the story. David asked, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for the sake of Jonathan?" Ziba, Saul's servant, answered the king, "There's still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet." So David asked, "Where is he?" Ziba answered, "He is at the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, in Lodabar." So King David had him brought from Lodabar to the house of Machir, son of Ammiel. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay David honor. David said, "Mephibosheth." He said, "I am at your service." "Do not be afraid," David said to him. "I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father, Jonathan. I'll restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul. You will always eat at my table." Mephibosheth bowed down and said, "What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me?" The king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, "I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and to his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him. You bring him in the crops so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. That's how many people were looking out for Mephibosheth. Then Ziba said to King David, "Your servant will do whatever my lord the king commands his servant to do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table, and he was lame in both feet. In the midst of all of his displays of power, David is still a man of kindness and mercy. David shows mercy to Mephibosheth, fulfilling his covenant with Jonathan. His compassion on the heels of his many conquests reveals that deep down inside, David had a heart that valued people over power. Let's skip ahead to the New Testament for just a moment. One of the curious distinctives about the Gospel of Matthew is that people tend to call Jesus Son of David. Matthew keeps painting Jesus as the Son of David to convince his Jewish readership that Jesus is the chosen king from David's line, the true king of Israel. But a curious development in Matthew's Gospel is that the only people who specifically call Jesus Son of David to his face are those with physical infirmities. 2 blind men in Galilee in chapter 9, a Canaanite woman whose daughter is suffering in chapter 15, 2 blind men in Jericho in chapter 20, and the blind and the lame in chapter 21. They recognize that King Jesus, like his ancestor David, gives a welcome place at his table to those with physical infirmities. In chapter 10, the power and the mercy kind of merge together as that mercy meets accountability. In the very next chapter, Samuel shows us these two things at work. David's prowess for war, tempered by his heart of mercy. In 2 Samuel 10, the king of the Ammonites dies. Now, these were the bitter enemies of Israel, one of about 100 bitter enemies of Israel. David saw an opportunity to show mercy and extend an olive branch. So he sent a delegation to the new Ammonite king to express his condolences. In the course of time, the king of the Ammonites died. So his son, Hanun, succeeded him as king. David thought, I'll show kindness to Hanun, son of Nahash, just as his father showed kindness to me. So David sent a delegation to express his sympathy to Hanun concerning his father. When David's men arrived at the Ammonite commanders said to Hanun, do you think David is actually honoring your father by sending envoys to express sympathy? Hasn't David sent them to you only to explore the city and spy it out so that he could subdue it? Hanun seized David's envoys, shaved off half of each man's beard, cut off their garments at the buttocks, and sent them away. When David heard this, he sent messengers to meet his men, for they were greatly humiliated. And he said, you stay in Jericho until your beards have grown out, and then you come home. The nobles and advisors in the king's court convinced the new king that David's delegation were actually spies and that David is trying to exploit their weaknesses. The enemies of God know David as a man of power and conquest. David's response is cold and calculated. He doesn't fly off the handle. He waits. He strategizes. The Ammonites knew that David was fuming, and they knew the hammer was going to come down hard. So they hired, in the next verses of the chapter, I won't read this part, they hired tens of thousands of mercenaries from the Arameans to fight with them ahead of the approaching conflict that David is going to instigate. But again, the power of Yahweh prevails, and Yahweh secured victory for David. David began by extending them mercy. When that mercy was rejected, the Ammonites were held accountable for their rejection. This is not an isolated idea in David's life. In Psalm 2, David is promised the allegiance, not just of Israel, but of the Gentiles. But his kindness, if resisted, if rejected, will be held accountable. For the psalm says that David will rule them with a rod of iron and dash them to pieces like pottery. Pharaoh was given mercy first, an opportunity to simply let the Israelites go. He rejected God's mercy and was held accountable. God gave the Amalekites plenty of time to repent of their sneaking up behind the wandering Hebrews and picking off the cripples and the weak. They refused his mercy and were held accountable. Mercy always comes with accountability. A couple of years ago, I had a student come to my office very distraught. Her father and I were very good friends, and she thought that friendship extended to her. It did mostly, but hang with me. She'd had what she thought was a very difficult week. I say that intentionally. What she thought was a very difficult week. I was about 2 hours behind on an assignment that was going to make or break her semester. I generally have a no late work policy in my courses. I communicate all the assignments up front, when they're due, and I'm trying to help my students understand that everything in life has a deadline. The mortgage company does not care what's going on in your life. They expect their payment on time, don't they? Yeah? She was going to miss this assignment. It was 40% of her grade. And missing it was going to mean failing the course that she needed to graduate. She came into my office very aggressively. She slammed my door, plopped herself down on my couch, and started crying. My semester's over. The whole tone of this was, this is my fault. My semester's over. I said, what's going on? Her response was something like, I'm going to change it up a little bit. I know that you're a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and collecting where you did not gather. Okay. She said, I can't get this done in the next 15 minutes, so I'm going to fail the course. I had a very calm conversation with her about her belligerent view of me. about her mistaken belief in my character, and I showed her kindness. I said, how much time do you need? She said, I just need a couple of hours. This was about 1 o'clock. I said, you can have until the end of the day. 2 weeks later, she came to my office again, slammed the door, plopped down on the couch, cried some story about having a hard week, not being able to get an assignment done for me in another course, and had a little meltdown. I've been watching her activities all across campus. She was doing all kinds of stuff except doing her work. I waited till she stopped crying. I let her get it all out of her system. And then I looked across my desk over my glasses, and I said, are you done? She said, yeah. I said, quit your whining, get to your room, and get back to work. Mercy demands accountability. She got it done. Listen, if you've been shown mercy by God, if God has rescued you from the pit of your life, shown you kindness when you didn't deserve it, He expects something from you. Loyalty, faithfulness, a willingness to participate in His purposes for your life and the world. That's how it works. Mercy demands accountability. David's power, or rather the power of God working through David, wasn't just the kind of power that kings tend to wield. It was a power that was rooted in the kindness and mercy of Yahweh. And as such, David becomes a type for Jesus, who will become great David's greater son. David's experience in these 3 chapters gives us an occasion to think about what it means to wield power, what godly power actually looks like. I'm running out of time, and so I'll be brief, but there are 2 things I'd like you to take home today as you think about David's experience. Here's the first thing. Godly power is a matter of kindness, not subjugation. We Americans are consumed with power. I have about a 30-minute rant on this that I cut from the sermon, so I'm just going to leave that hanging there. It's not just a social issue. It's not just a societal problem. It's a church problem. The church is enamored with displays of American-style power. So many churches believe that their success is measured in displays of what the world calls power. Building projects that signal to everyone around us in the community and to other churches how powerful we are. Attendance figures that signal our power to spread the gospel. Political engagement that signals our church's alignment with political power, and that happens on both sides of the aisle. Celebrity speakers that demonstrate their power to reach everyone. I'm trying to break that mold today. And sometimes in certain church circles, it's demonstrations of the Spirit's power in exorcisms or prophecies or speaking in tongues. In 2023, just 2 years ago, James River Church in Springfield, Missouri, opened its 5,000 attendee men's conference on fighting for the Lord by rolling tanks into the building with men hanging out the top, shooting off machine guns. We have confused dominance for dominion. We have confused supremacy for sovereignty. And we have confused tyranny for triumph. And in doing so, we've communicated to the world all the wrong things about the gospel and about the true character of God. When was the last time that you saw a church measure its success in terms of how many widows it took care of, or how many homeless it housed, or how many orphans it has parented? James says pure and faultless religion is to do just these things. When Jesus had the power to call down 12 legions of angels and display his own military might against his enemies, you know what he did? Healed the severed ear of one of his enemies. Godly power is a matter of kindness. Here's the second thing I want you to walk home with. How you wield power reveals your heart. In 2014, allegations began to emerge about the founding pastor of a 14,000-member church in Seattle called Mars Hill. Their speaker was a very powerful speaker, best-selling author, represented this manly man's way of practicing the faith. But the allegations that came down were that behind the scenes, he was abusive to his staff, merciless about their performance metrics, and that he bullied not just those on his staff, but also those on his eldership. He has since repented. But the way he wielded his power revealed a heart that was far from God. Jesus had power, no doubt about that. But his wielding of power revealed a heart that was kind to sinners and to the infirm. It was the kind of power that forgave his enemies rather than dominated them. And the way he demonstrated his power revealed a heart rooted in the character of God. A few years ago, I was visiting a friend out in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I got the chance to go to the Billy Graham Library. It's sort of a museum of Billy Graham's ministry and whatnot. His childhood home is there. It's really quite something. As I was walking through the central part of the museum, there is a display case there, pretty wide, and underneath the glass, all kinds of trinkets from his ministry. There's a .38 revolver, a snub nose there, given to him by a gang member who repented at his. Can you imagine me preaching today and you just walk up here and hand me a pistol? That okay? I did have a guy hand me a can of Skull Bandits one time after I preached. I'm like, bro, I don't know if this is sin. Well, for him it was. He needed to get rid of that. One of the curious things I'll never forget was underneath this glass display case was a letter typewritten from Richard Nixon, thanking Billy Graham for his loaning him of the vast sum of money of $5. The story went like this. They were both at a revival together. I'm assuming Billy Graham was preaching the revival, and Nixon had happened to be there with the Secret Service. And he told him, he said, look, I don't carry cash with me anymore. I get carded everywhere I go, and the Treasury Department pays for everything. I don't have any money on me. So he was incredibly embarrassed at the revival when they passed the offering plate, and he had nothing to put in it. So he turned to Billy Graham, and he said, hey, can I borrow $5? And Billy Graham gave him $5. He put it in the plate, and the letter came with, and what was there was the $5 bill that he sent him, came with the $5 that he replaced. And he said, thank you for the gift, the loaning me of $5. I was incredibly embarrassed. And then he said this, would that the global financial crisis currently happening could be handled with such grace and mercy. Two men at the height of their power being kind to one another. We love to think about what it might be like if we were king. Oh, our poets will help us think through that. Tom Petty, it's good to be king. Or the Thompson Twins, if I were king for just one day. Or Matchbox 20's The Real World, in which the singer fantasizes of being about the true and benevolent CEO. We all know that the world is broken. And it's broken because every person in power is not as good at power as I would be. In the words of my favorite Canadian band, Great Big Sea, the world will sing when I am king. But the reality is, without a heart formed by the righteousness of God, I would be as evil, brutal, selfish, and pompous as every other person in power. Because the acquisition of power doesn't change your heart. It reveals what's already in there. So let me ask you, what is it that's deep down in your heart? Has your heart been changed by the gospel? Is your heart attuned to righteousness and kindness and mercy? Or is your heart selfish, envious, and malicious? The key to changing all that is the mercy of Israel's truest king, King Jesus, and the redemption that he offers. The Spirit of God that he gives to take up residence in our hearts and effect deep and lasting change. I have the band come, Seth is going to come, but this is the time for you. If you need that change in your life, Seth is going to walk you through that.
Thank you, Les. I appreciate that so much, you being here. We do want to give you an opportunity. Come on up, guys. We want to give you an opportunity to respond to the message. Kept thinking the two words that kept coming to my heart and mind as Les was preaching was grace and mercy. And I love what the Apostle Paul tells us, that we were once dead in our trespasses and our sins. We were children of wrath, but God, in his great mercy, according to his great love, has caused us to be born again in Jesus, that we have been saved by grace. And that's what Jesus offers. to each and every one of us. And so if you need that in your life this morning, we invite you to step out and step forward in faith and confess Jesus as Lord and receive him as your Savior. Go ahead and stand up together.